I would like to welcome Dr. Linda Rogers today for her grand rounds on mobile technology in asthma care and research. Dr. Rogers received her medical degree from NYU. She completed her internal medicine residency training at Columbia Presbyterian before returning to NYU for pulmonary and critical care fellowship. She served as the medical director of the Bellevue Hospital Chest Clinic and assistant director of the Bellevue Hospital Asthma Program. Since joining the faculty at Mount Sinai, she continues to have an active clinical practice and make tremendous contributions to asthma research. She is currently the clinical director of the Adult Asthma Program at the Mount Sinai National Jewish Health Respiratory Institute and the medical director of the Clinical Trials Office for the Department of Medicine. Her main clinical and research focus is difficult to control and severe refractory asthma. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogers.
Hi, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Just some disclosures before we start. I am a clinical investigator and an advisory board member for a number of companies. Those are not really relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. And in fact, I don't have any personal or financial relationships with respect to this activity, but I am going to be talking about an initiative that we developed in collaboration with Apple, but neither I nor the Respiratory Institute have received any form of financial compensation for those activities, which makes me actually very sad, but it's the unfortunate truth. And actually, in the introduction, you were asked to turn off your cell phones, but I'm actually going to ask you to do the opposite. I actually want you all to leave your cell phones on. I will not be offended. You guys can check your stock picks, you can check your sports scores, you can surf your email, you can check your Instagram feeds, you can check your Facebook feeds. But most of you are pretty aware of this right now, that when you are doing that, someone is collecting data on you. They are conducting research, possibly without your consent. Now, we are not Facebook, we are not allowed to do that. But the reason all of these marketers do that is because of the reach of mobile phone technology. And when I started working on the project that I'm about to present to you, the data was this. So I started working in this area in about 2015. And at that point, the world population was about 7.2 billion. At that point, there were 25 billion devices, mobile devices, about 3.5 per person, meaning we all have multiple of these devices as we either use them for different purposes or upgrade and throw one in the drawer in the back of our house. There were 3 billion smartphone subscriptions, and there were about 10 billion sensors in those phones. And I'm going to show to you what the projected data is for 2020 from this reference, which is the world population in 2020 will be 7.6 billion. At that point, we will have about 50 billion devices out there with about 1 trillion sensors. And that's to say these devices have enormous reach, and I want you to start thinking of them a little bit differently than you think about them right now. They are enmeshed in our lives, in our daily use for a lot of our calendars and social purposes, but I want you to start thinking about these as devices that can be used for biomedical research. And so what are the tools in these phones that we use every day? We sort of take this a little bit for granted and do this a little automatically. We make phone calls, we do all the things that I mentioned earlier, but these devices are actually powerful computers that you're walking around with every single day. They use a variety of technologies, including accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers, and devices to detect our position in space. They detect our movement, our speed of movement, our personal position. They can detect where our body is in proximity to the device. They have cameras that we mostly use to take pictures of our friends and our loved ones and activities that we're doing, but I'm going to show you that those cameras and that imaging technology can be used for different purposes. They have microphones. We make phone calls, we listen to music, but those microphones in particular I think are going to be important for the inhaled technologies that I'm going to show you. And they also have microwave radio frequency, or Bluetooth. And we use that to typically use our wireless headphones, but that technology allows us to connect with a universe of medical devices that then can be downloaded into your phone and can be collected for either medical care or for research purposes. And so here's your phone, right? This we know. You know, many of us have Apple Watches, Fitbits, different devices, but these devices can collect data on our activity and our sleep and our movement and bring that into our phone. But now there's a whole universe of medical devices that can be input into your phone. There are now FDA-approved blood pressure monitoring devices, so somebody who's interested in purchasing this can monitor their blood pressure continuously for 24 hours and transmit that somewhere to whoever is interested. There's a wide universe of cardiovascular monitoring systems, from EKGs to arrhythmia detectors, and some of this technology is also available in implantable devices. There are FDA-approved 24-hour glucose monitors. And there's fascinating technology using imaging, and it's really beyond sort of the scope of what I'd like to talk about today, to talk about some of this, but just to give you some examples. There's actually a microscope that's been developed that can connect to your iPhone, and that's been used in the developing world to look at pathology specimens, and then the images can be transmitted to somewhere where there's expertise to interpret them. We use bedside ultrasound here, and if any of you have seen our fellows sort of dragging around sort of ultrasound machine. In the time that we've been doing ultrasound in critical care, the machines have gone from being this size to maybe the ones they're running around with now are about this size on a cart of wheel, but I propose to you that soon we're going to be doing this with our phones at the bedside, and those devices already exist. And then there's the area that I'm really interested in, and I'll talk about briefly towards the end of this talk after I present you with our work, which is the universe of digital inhalers and digital spirometers, which can also input into these devices and be collected for clinical care and for research purposes. And so apart from sort of all those fancy technologies, these phones can be used for sort of very mundane research purposes. You can sort of send somebody by text message or email a standardized questionnaire or a questionnaire about a disease state. You can send someone reminders for medication doses, appointment reminders. We've all used these. You can link to educational materials, and you can actually trend all of this data. And so just to put all of that together and just to say that these really have the power to contribute to research. And so how do you do research with a mobile phone? You can actually do it a standard way and use a device in a standard research meeting in an academic medical center and put something on someone's phone and have them come back and forth to the visit, or you can actually conduct research completely remotely. And that's what I'm going to show you how we did today. And so our group, as we got involved in the particular project that I'm going to show you, asked ourselves, is it possible to actually recruit patients to participate in a research study completely remotely? Can you consent someone remotely? Will the IRB let you do that? And I'm going to show you that yes, and I have the gray hair to prove it. Can you take all of that data and all that protected health information and transmit it securely to a research center? And is the data you get accurate, or is somebody sitting on a bed somewhere and sort of, is it Russia, is it China, or is it somebody sitting on the bed somewhere just faking it? But I'm going to show you that you can get accurate data this way. And so that's my goal. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about a project we did with something called the Asthma Health App. And our study was called the Asthma Mobile Health Study. And this was really a sort of test case for how you do digital health research. I'm going to show you that you can conduct low-risk research completely remotely, away from an academic medical center. In this project, the groups that worked on this endeavor in a couple of locations around the country, together we collaborated with Apple and created a model for electronic remote research consent. And I'm going to show you that we can collect this data remotely and accurately, completely by mobile phone, without a study participant ever stepping foot into an academic research center. And so, sort of, in my introduction, they described that I joined Mount Sinai in about 2014. And I remember in about August of 2014, I got a call from my division chief, and I was actually on vacation at the time. And this is sort of like those behavioral questions we're asking in the research interview. What do you do if your division chief calls you up in the middle of your vacation and asks you to come to a meeting? But in hindsight, I'm very grateful that I did, because it allowed me to become involved in a super interesting project. And when I was asked to join the faculty here, I am an average technology user. I'm not a Luddite, and I am not a sophisticated techie. But I was asked to come to a meeting where there were a lot of kind of important-looking people, and I didn't know who any of them were at the time. And they were talking about developing apps for asthma. And they were talking about something called ResearchKit, which I have to say, I left the meeting and I really had no idea what they were talking about. I was like, what's this ResearchKit thing that they're talking about? I better go look that up. And many of you may know what ResearchKit is right now, but for those of you who don't, this is an open source framework that was designed by Apple to simplify and standardize development of apps for research. Basically, it is a framework that you kind of plug in what your needs are for a particular research study. It has a framework for electronic consent, and I will say I'm going to present to you the data of the Asthma app, but the 5 inaugural apps really were key to developing this process. It was kind of half developed at the time we started this initiative. It has an area where you can plug in surveys and questionnaires. It has technology to send out those surveys at a particular time, remind someone to take a medication if they're going to take a medication, and a variety of notifications can come across by the usual ways you get notifications through apps. And then it can link to a variety of devices. And at the time we initiated this project, it was the interface between ResearchKit, it mainly connected with something called HealthKit. And if you guys look at in your phones, you can see, which I told you to keep out, you can see there is an app like this that has a little heart, and that's your health app. And that can link to your Fitbit or your Apple Watch or a number of other devices that may collect your activity and fitness and sleep data. And that allowed HealthKit integrated with ResearchKit to allow you to collect that data that was being monitored for research purposes. In the interim, since we launched our project, ResearchKit actually now also interfaces with something called CareKit. And what CareKit is a framework for industry that allows developers of medical devices to have their devices input into a phone, and that then potentially can interact with ResearchKit so you can collect that data for research purposes. And there was also technology that was developed with one of our research partners, a group called Sage Bionetworks, that allowed us to transmit all of this data reliably and securely in compliance with sort of the typical regulatory requirements that we have that Facebook doesn't have. And so this is the app. So this is the Asthma Health App. And we, after I left that meeting in 2014, I met a really great group that I then worked with over the last couple of years. And we were charged with sort of developing the content for this app. And I was sort of charged with developing the asthma content. And we wanted to make this both an experience for patients to be able to use the app, to learn about their asthma, to manage their asthma, to track it over time. But on the other side of that, we wanted to take what they were inputting on their phone and sort of collect it in real time and be able to study. And so that's what we did. And so there were a number of things that participants would do. They would input their symptom frequency, whether they were having daytime or nighttime symptoms and how those symptoms affected their activity. They would input what medications they were using. Were they using daily controller medication? Were they using their rescue inhalers? They could then describe what in their environment, if anything, had triggered their symptoms, an infection, increased physical activity, smells, exhaust, smoke, exposure to pets, whatever thing in their environment was potentially triggering their asthma symptoms. They were allowed to put in peak flow data, and this was not from a Bluetooth-enabled peak flow device. We sort of tried that, but couldn't quite make it happen in time, as those devices were in fairly early development back when we started and had to launch this project. But if a patient was using their peak flow monitor at home, they were allowed to input that data, and we were able to collect it. They were pinged on a weekly basis, asking them if they had been to the hospital or emergency room or had had an urgent visit with their physician, had they been prescribed prednisone, had there been a change in their medication. And then we monitored their physical activity, and they were able, if they were using any kind of activity monitoring devices, with their permission, which they were not obligated to give, but they could give if they chose, we were allowed to collect all their activity data and correlate it with whatever else was going on with their disease. And then they were also receiving reminders, and so they would get a reminder to take their medication. And we also partnered with a vendor called Breezometer that gave them air quality data that was specific to their location. And so if it was sort of, you were in the Northeast and it was August and it was high ozone season, they would get an air quality warning about that. And then based on all the data that they were inputting into this device, they actually got some feedback in terms of their asthma control. And we used criteria from the Global Initiative of Asthma. And you can sort of see here, they would, looking at this screenshot, you can look at data from the last 4 weeks or up to 12 weeks ago, and based on GINA criteria and the data that they inputted, they would get feedback. So this patient, you can see, was partly controlled. They had 2 instances of daytime symptoms in a particular week. They weren't waking at night, they didn't use their reliever medicine, and they had one instance of activity limitation due to their asthma. They could also see what their activity level was and how it correlated with their period of control here. So you could see here they were more active in these 4 weeks and then less active 4 to 8 weeks ago, et cetera. And that actually was, we call that our doctor dashboard. So anybody could take that into their doctor's office, show that to the patient, and we designed it in a way so that somebody wasn't downloaded with information, bombarded with a sort of screenshot of information. They could look at that and really get a sort of encapsulation of how the patient was doing over time. The device was also linked to a lot of educational materials for the patients, and so these were sourced through our partners at National Jewish Health, and there were videos so people can learn inhaler technique, watch physician-approved videos in terms of how they should manage their asthma. And then they were allowed actually to keep their own data. And so at the end of the study, they can press a button and it would download all the data they collected in their study, and they can keep that on their computers. And they were also able to choose how the data was shared. And I'm going to show you that with our, a little bit of a cartoon about how the data flowed. So in order to do all this, again, we're not Facebook. We're not allowed to collect data in an academic institution without getting consent from patients. And sort of one of the conundrums that we faced was sort of, how do you get consent, particularly if patients weren't going to come to see you? And so you guys recognize this template, right? Any of you who have done research recognize this. And this is sort of our standard traditional research consent document. And the first thing we realized when we were developing this is that you can't input like a 20-page PDF of this into a phone and have that really be a good way to get consent through this technology. And so it really required us to develop a new framework for doing consent. And I think everyone would agree, even the people who create these things in our IRBs, is that these are not great ways to convey information. Oftentimes information, we try to highlight what are the salient features, but it often gets lost in sort of the wall of text that's coming from you. And these are really legal documents. And the complexity in their sort of nature can actually maybe, one could argue that it inhibits understanding. And so we had to sort of work out a new way of doing this that at the same time fit into our regulatory requirements. And so we tried to do that by developing a sort of a multimedia consent process. And this is my co-principal investigator, Yvonne Chan, who's the head of digital health at the Icon Institute. And Yvonne and I had to sit and get videoed one day for our video consent. And so when you sort of enter the study, you come through here. You can have someone present the entire data to you through video and just listen to it if that's your choice, but that's not mandated. You then had to undergo an evaluation for if you were even eligible for the study. And so we only allowed those who were over age 18. You had to have a physician diagnosis of asthma. We collected data on smoking and comorbid diseases, and then we censored our results and did our analysis accordingly, but we did not restrict people, for example, if they smoked. And then if you didn't actually meet any of the criteria, you were actually stopped at that point in the consent process if you checked yes to any of the exclusion criteria, or if you checked no to any of the exclusion criteria. If you were 12 years old, you were actually prompted to uninstall the app and you weren't allowed to continue through in the consent process. And so then we really wanted to, instead of presenting people with a wall of text, sort of try to highlight what we thought were the most important pieces of information that the participant had to focus on in order to understand the study and agree and give consent to participate in the study. And we did that using these things that I learned this terminology, iconic interfaces. Did not know that when I started this project. So these are our iconic interfaces. And so the key things that we had to have the participants understand when they participated in the study was, first of all, that this device was not a source of medical care. And this was a source of extreme anxiety and many sleepless nights for me, because I knew that we were potentially could be collecting asthma information on, who knows, thousands of patients. There was probably going to be some pretty scary symptom frequency in there, but we were not allowed to act on that. And actually, the design of that at this point in time is the sort of regulatory line that crosses this from becoming a device that somebody can use to self-monitor their disease. But the minute you interact and give direct medical advice to a specific patient based on specific information, that is then a medical device that has to be regulated by the FDA and for which you need an IDE. And since we only had 6 months to develop this, we did not have time to get an IDE. So we were not allowed, for example, to create an action plan for the patients or to send even a warning that go call your doctor because your asthma symptoms. And so the first issue they had to consider was, and that we had to highlight was, This is not a source of medical care. That was number one. Number two was sort of how the data was going to be used. And number three was sort of the security of the data. And number four was how the data was going to be shared with others. And patients actually who participated in this had a lot of options of how to share their data. But one of the charges of this project was that this was open source, and that the data had to be shared publicly with our partner Sage Biome Networks on their server, meaning that at the end of the study, the data after a certain embargo period needed to be made available to anyone who wanted to access this data. And data is now publicly sourced for anybody who wants to use it. And so you can see here, there is a sort of basic blurb about the main point that people had to understand to participate, and then they can press next and get more information if they wanted to. And they were then the question becomes is how do you sort of, when we give consent in a research study, it's not that we're allowed to just hand someone an 8-page document and have them sign them. There's supposed to be some kind of interaction with the investigator, some kind of discussion, an ability to ask and answer questions. But how do you do that when somebody's completely remote from you at a research site? And so we actually had a little bit of a quiz, and it was sort of very brief. It was 5 questions on those sort of salient points that we highlighted, that we felt that if people demonstrated an ability to understand those key points, they could give consent in the study. But it was a sort of a tough point that we had to hash out with the IRB, that there wasn't sort of person-to-person contact. And actually, in the end, we did give our participants an opportunity to request a phone call or request an email to discuss the consent process. And I'll show you your data. We didn't actually get one request, I think, from anybody to do that. But this kind of consent can't be like a EULA. For those of you who don't know what a EULA is an end-user license agreement. So when you guys all download an app, you know those things you scroll through and you don't read, and then you press a button at the end, just so you can go about and do what you want to do. Generally, hidden in those small words is permission to use your data, and that's why they then can use those apps to collect data on you and sell those to marketers. But a research consent can't be a EULA. We can't have people just scrolling through there. And so we had to really demonstrate that people were engaging the material and understanding the material. Oops. Hold on. And at the end of all of that, we still have regulations we have to adhere to. And so the patient has to get a copy of their consent, and any of you who do research know that. And we had to actually keep a copy of consent on file. So how are you going to do that electronically? And so the device was actually developed so that they got a copy of the consent that was actually in the app at all time. And so literally, the patient who was participating could look back at the consent document at any time that they chose right in their app. And then once they provided their electronic signature, we actually got emailed a copy of consent, and it was actually archived digitally. And for, again, those of you who took research and had huge binders of consents and sort of paper source documents, it was really nice to actually be able to put all of that on a server. And so that was a sort of nice technology that was developed out of all of this. And so I think one of the most unique aspects of the project is this whole process of e-consent. So it's multi-step, it's multimedia. You can develop this in such a way so that it's suitable for someone who has low literacy or numeracy. You can present data in any given ways other than in print. You can present it in multiple languages. We used video, iconic interfaces, layered information to try to really bring out the key points that were necessary to understand to give consent. You could proceed at your own pace. And so a participant out in the community could start to watch the video. They could press pause. They can come back to it later. It would still be where they left off. They could read half the consent document. They can go have lunch, come back. So you were able to do this completely at your own pace, and there was no restrictions to how much time you were needed to do this. They were able to access the full consent document at all times. We documented their comprehension in real time. And we actually used approaches to sort of ensure that they weren't just swiping through. And so there were requirements in terms of time people needed to spend on anything. And so I think in the end we developed, and were actually able to convince our IRB that we developed a pretty rigorous consent process. And then we were able to sort of adhere to all sort of required regulations. And so that was our first challenge, developing the consent process. And that was done in conjunction with a number of partners. But I think many of the details were worked out at the academic institutions that were all participating in ResearchKit. The other aspect was convincing our respective institutions that we were going to be able to maintain privacy of data. And so as I showed you some of the data we were collecting, we collected a bunch of surveys, and patients had a bunch of tasks that they needed to do. We partnered with a vendor that was collecting air quality data, and that air quality data, pollen data, weather data, flu patterns, was geolocated. And so once you're geolocated, depending on where you are, if you're here and there's, tens of thousands of people in your building, we're not going to be able to identify you based on your location at this address. But if you're in a remote area of the country where, 100 people live in a particular zip code, your zip code can become an identifier. And so we had to think of a way of protecting people's identity that way. We were collecting people's activity data, and depending on what kind of device they used, there were a lot of personal identifiers in that, and we had to make sure to maintain the privacy of that. And your phone in itself has a lot of identifiers. I mean, many of you now use biometrics, your fingerprint, to enter your phone. That's a personal identifier. There's about 19 different personal identifiers in your phone, including IP addresses, device IDs, phone numbers, and any variety of personal information that's available in your phone or that you're inputting in the study. And we had to guarantee that we were going to maintain the privacy of all of that. And so this part, I certainly didn't design this part because I do not have the technical skills of this, but we worked with an amazing, amazing group of people. But basically, the app was locked and you had to sign in. And there were actually several layers of encryption and several layers of security keys. And so we as investigators wanted to be able to do research looking at geolocalized information. But we definitely didn't want to post people's location on the SAGE server, which we were required to do for this study. And so without getting into sort of the technical details, there were basically two keys. There was a SAGE public key and a Mount Sinai key. And the Mount Sinai key was restricted to certain investigators. And we used something called a bridge server. And so when the app sort of called into the bridge server and data was transmitted, and basically for the public data set, I think it's 21 PHI identifiers were stripped out of the data, and only a de-identified data set was kept on the server. And for us, we actually were able to get an identified set using our Mount Sinai private key, and that was allowed to be downloaded to our servers under the security of our institution. And I can refer you to a reference that talks about that process in more detail. And so now that we were able to get consent, and we were able to ensure, or we at least convinced the IT people on the IRB that we were able to maintain privacy of the patient's data. We were given permission and we were allowed to post this in the App Store. And we really didn't know at this point if people were going to go to the App Store and download an app and participate in a study. Would that even work? And so we were one of 5 inaugural research kit apps. Mount Sinai did asthma. I think it was Mass General and Harvard did a diabetes project, Stanford did a cardiovascular project, and then Sage Bionetworks, which was one of our partners, did a breast cancer and a Parkinson's related project. And those were the 5 initial apps. If you go into the App Store now, there's now probably 30, 40 plus research kit apps that are in there, and many institutions are developing this. But we were sort of the first 5, and we were really excited about this. And in March of 2015, I was sort of nervously sitting in my living room, sort of the night of the launch. And the night of the launch was actually the night of the Apple announcement. And for any of you who are techie folks, each year Apple announces its initiatives that year and its different products that year. And so in March, that was the night of the Apple announcement, and Research Kit was going to be announced. And so I had never done research like this before. I had done mostly clinical trials. And as a clinical trialist, we are always struggling to recruit patients to our studies. It's one of the hardest things that we do. And we generally do something like this. And I've done this, so I'm not judging this flyer. But you can see here, we post a sad flyer somewhere. We sit there and we cut little things so that people can rip them off, so that they can contact us. And you can see here 5 people, rip this off. Maybe some of them will call us, maybe it won't. But I have to tell you, there is no more effective recruitment tool than having the COO of Apple get up and announce your research study. And most people who develop these apps are not going to have that luxury. We actually happen to have that luxury. And this is a picture of that moment. And he got up there and he said some things that were actually not correct about our project, and I had agita. And then what ended up happening was actually there were 15,000 downloads of all the 5 research kit apps within hours of the Apple announcement. We had several thousand downloads within our first 24 hours. Now, all of those downloads didn't translate into somebody who went through the consent process and participated in the study. And so there was really a lot of excitement and a lot of press initially, and we had a lot of downloads and we had a lot of participation. But even after sort of the initial sort of media frenzy died down, we were getting downloads of about 300 and 400 downloads a month completely passively. And out of that, we would get about an enrollment rate of about a third. And so without any recruitment activity, any advertising, this just sitting in the App Store and just word of mouth, we were getting 100 patients into our study a month completely passively. And so this was our study, and we were very excited. We published this in Nature Biotech in March of 2017, and I'm going to show you some of the results. We had about 40,000 app downloads overall in the USA. We had a little blip of some outside the country, which was a source of stress because that's not permitted by the IRB, but all of those were deleted. And then we had about 8,500 patients out of those 40,000 went through the consent process. We then had to verify their identity, and so there was sort of typically what happens like when you lose your password and there's a sort of cycle of email identification. We had a sort of technology like that to sort of try to ensure that the user was who they said they were. And so about 7,500, let me say here, enrolled users who had given consent were then had their identity verified. And then about 6,400 people gave us baseline data. So in about 6 months, we got cross-sectional data on 6,400 people with asthma, which I think is pretty amazing. And then people went on to use this in a variety of ways because all the data, there were no mandatory questions here. Any of the participants were able to answer or refuse to answer any particular questions. And what I will tell you is that creates really messy data. So I can refer you to a separate paper that talks about how to analyze that. That's beyond my understanding, but I was lucky enough to work with a really good group that knows how to do all of that. For analysis, we had basically two cohorts. We had our baseline users, a cohort we called our robust users, which were patients who were non-smokers, didn't have a comorbid disease that could confound their asthma symptoms, were above age 18, and who had completed at least 5 surveys during the course of the study. And then, as we all know, we're all very enthusiastic in the beginning of a study. You know, we get our watch or our Fitbit, and we're watching everything, and then a couple of months later, it's in the back of the drawer. So, you know, at the end of 6 months, we tried to sort of collect some final information on our participants to see what was the outcomes and what was their feedback at the course of their studies. And I'm going to refer to those as our milestone users, but there were only about 175 of our milestone users. And so sort of how did they get their data, just to give you a little bit of a flavor about this, about how they were asked questions. Like when we do a study in a research center, we give like 50 questionnaires to patients and they sit there and they answer a lot of questions. And we wanted to try to space that out over time to make it an easier experience for people. And so there were certain things that would appear on the first day, like their baseline asthma history. And you could see here about 6,000 patients answered that. We collected demographic information that appeared on the third day. About 4,200 people answered that. And you can sort of just generally see the ID here. And then what people would get is they would get texted with their daily survey. And their daily survey was designed to be really simple. They got 3 questions. Did they have any asthma symptoms that day? Did they use their rescue medicine that day? If they answered no, they were done after 3 questions. It took under 30 seconds. If they had symptoms that day, they were asked what kind of medication they used and what their triggers were. And so in total, at worst, it was 8 questions that you can complete in 30 to 45 seconds. They then got their weekly survey, and that was really about had they had any contact with the healthcare system. At 90 days, we administered a quality of life survey. And then our milestone survey at the end of the study appeared at day 165, and we tried to go back and collect some additional demographics at that time. And so how did people sort of engage with this? And so you could see there's certainly drop-off with any kind of project like this, with a lot of enthusiasm initially and some fading over time. And so these in blue were the patients who entered the study in the first month, and they had probably the best traction. They were our biggest enthusiasts. They were the ones who were probably watching the Apple announcement. And you could see here that a majority of those, upward of 80%, were still participating at 90 days, and that there was sort of attrition down to about 50% at the end of about 6 months, and that the patients who participated later had sort of a little bit of a rapid attrition rate. And so you can see here that we tried to sort of conduct a longitudinal study, and I would say that this technology probably is not ideal for sort of doing that, or if you're doing that, you probably need to incentivize them in a certain way. In this study, we had no incentives. There was no reimbursement. We didn't gamify it in any way, and so I think you would expect there to be attrition over time. There was also differences in participation by age, and you can see here it was sort of a little bit opposite that I expected. I expected the young people to sort of stay in the study, and the younger people were the ones who lost interest earlier, as shown in blue. So these were the 18 to 40-year-olds, and these were those over age 40 who sort of stuck in there and were more patient and participated in our study longer. And so you can see here, out at 100 days, we still had about 80% participation, maybe about 60% of the 18 to 40 cohort. And then, when you get out to 6 months, people start to sort of drop off to about 50%. And so what kind of data did we get? And so, a lot of people asked us, they said, how do we know that people aren't just sitting there and putting in fake asthma data? And the truth is, well, there was not one way to know for sure. And so really what we needed to do was to try to validate our data in some method. Did our data represent other asthma studies? Did our data represent population-based data? Or did our data make sense in terms of input of data from patients who had asthma? And so here's sort of some of our baseline demographics of our patients. And what we did was we pulled out the CDC data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, many of you are, but those of you who are not, that's population-based sampling, where, when you write that first page of a paper with asthma that says X million of people in the country have asthma, that's where the data comes from. And so this is sort of the breakdown of our population. So about 54% of our participants were aged 18 to 34, and that's a little higher than the CDC data, where 36% of CDC asthma patients are between 18 and 34. Our data for sort of ages 35 and 64 were fairly close, and we had a little bit of an underrepresentation of people over 65, which might be expected based on the technology that we were using. Interestingly, the gender data was completely flipped, at least in the initial portion of the study. If you look at any study of asthma, particularly in adults, it's generally 60% women and 40% male, and that represents the demographics of the prevalence of asthma in adults. Ours was a little flipped. It was actually 60% male and 40% female over the entire course of the study. But what's interesting is that we had a big male participation very early in the study, and then as the later data we collected actually more resembled the CDC data. And so later on, when we were sort of just collecting routine data, it was really closer to population-based data. And then in terms of race ethnicity, we mostly sort of resembled the population, except we had an underrepresentation of African Americans. And that probably has to do with some demographics of who uses what kinds of phones, and I'll show you that shortly. As is expected, our population was probably more highly educated and had higher income than the population at large. And so you can see here that compared to the general population of people who have asthma, there were more college graduates, people with at least some college or who had graduated college, and their income was on the higher end of the spectrum than the general population of patients with asthma. They were also actually sicker than the average population of asthma. So 11% of our patients had visited the ER in the last 6 months, despite their higher education level, which is a little bit interesting, and 6% of them had been hospitalized in the prior 6 months. And the data, population-based data from the CDC is about 8% of patients visit the ER in a particular annual period, or 2% are hospitalized in an annual area. So we had some differences in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, education of income, and severity of illness. And some of that probably had to do with who uses Androids, who uses iPhones, and who uses a different device. And so just to kind of give you guys some context, 28% of people in the US use iPhones, about 25% use Androids, and 47% use some other device. And there were differences in those use patterns based on income, with iPhone users tending to be higher income, with fewer blacks using actually iPhones as opposed to Android devices, and differences in educational levels. And that probably accounted for some of our findings, for sure. I don't know quite how to explain the gender findings, but they are what they are. And the fact that sicker people might use a device like this probably makes a little bit of sense, because if your asthma is not really bothering you, you might not be all that interested in using an asthma app. But what that does do is it gets a sicker group of people who maybe live remote from an academic research center, engaged in a study. So you could look at it as a sort of advantage or as a disadvantage. Who was using what kind of medication? So about 64% of our patients were using some kind of asthma control medication, and 32% were not. And of the people who were using daily medication, about 65% were using combination therapy, ICS/LABA, and about 35% were using an inhaled corticosteroid. And then based on their initial data, we were able to assess their control at the time of entry into the study. And about 43% were uncontrolled, and about another sort of greater than 50% were partly controlled or well controlled. And there are many publications looking at this, and there'll be some variability in the number, but if you look across the US, about half of patients are typically uncontrolled. So we felt that this was a fairly reasonable representation of what was going on, and especially considering that our population was probably sicker than the average population of patients with asthma. And so how do we know any of this were real? So we collected baseline data, and then we had patients inputting data prospectively. And so did our prospective data match what the patients put in at baseline? And the answer is yes. And so shown here was their classification of their level of control by GINA criteria at baseline. And then what their daily symptoms were, what their nightly symptoms were, what their quick relief medicine use was, and what their controller use was, according to their baseline classification. And it all kind of made sense. Patients who were uncontrolled had greater daytime symptoms, greater nighttime symptoms, and more frequent use of their beta agonists. Patients who were partly controlled had fewer daytime symptoms, and people who were well controlled had the least symptoms, the least nighttime symptoms, and the least quick relief use. And then conversely, the people who were well controlled had the greatest percentage of controller use. Those that were partially controlled or uncontrolled had the lower levels of controller use. So that sort of all seemed to make sense. Our baseline data correlated with our prospectively collected data. What about lung function? And so we were not collecting lung function on everybody because not everybody was using a peak flow meter, and certainly not everybody was giving us their peak flow data. But we did get peak flow data from a sort of robust group of patients. And so for those of you not familiar with lung function, your lung function, and in this case your peak flow, is dependent on a couple of things. The level of severity of your disease, your age, your gender, and your height. So we're able to look at that data and look at those variables and see if it all made sense. So you can see here, red are partly controlled patients, and green are uncontrolled patients. The dotted lines here are males, and the solid lines are females. And so you can sort of see here the trend for partly controlled males had the highest lung function, and that correlated with their height. The uncontrolled males were higher than the controlled females, and their lung function correlated with their height. And you can see here that the partly controlled females then came after that, and the uncontrolled females had the lowest lung function. And so this sort of made sense, and so we feel like this sort of validated some of the data that we were receiving. I don't think you would be able to fake these trends. What happens with people's activity? And so we had a cohort of users who were giving us their activity monitor data, and did that sort of correlate at all or change over the course of the study? So did participation in the study or use of the app impact their activity? And so this study, the 6-month period, was conducted over a spring until the fall for the first 6 months of the study that was later extended. And so it's because there are probably seasonal issues in how active people are, we did analysis in 2 different ways. One was looking at activity levels at the first week of the study and compare who was reporting limitation to their activity and whether that changed over the 6 months of the study. And so in the first week of the study, 25% of patients reported activity levels, and there was a modest decrease over the course of the study. And if you restricted that to one season where people were maybe going to be the most active, the people who participated, 25% of them again reported reduced activity at the beginning of the summer, and over the course of the study that was reduced to 10%. So perhaps the ones who used it persistently were more active. This is a subset of patients, so I would interpret that with caution, but it did show some impact over the course of the study. And then what happened to their control over the course of the study? And so some of the numbers I presented you before, you could see here that 20% were, about 18 to 20% were well controlled here at the beginning of the study, about just under 40% were partially controlled, and just over 40% were poorly controlled. And our robust users, the ones who did at least 5 surveys, were pretty close to that. What happened at the end of 6 months? We were only able to get that data from our milestone users, and granted that our milestone users are probably a very select population. But here's the distribution of control of our milestone users. And so at the beginning of the study, here almost 50% were partly controlled, and another 40% were uncontrolled, and over 10% were controlled. Those milestone users, about 40% of them were controlled at the end of the study. And so again, it's a select group of people who continue to use it. Interpret that as you will, but there was some evidence that participation impacted their asthma control. We were then collecting environmental data, and sort of this turned out to be sort of very interesting. And so we collected data on pollen, temperature, and air quality. And we collected that over mostly 2 seasons, sort of spring and summer, and you were able to see what patients reported as triggers of their symptoms over their time periods. And so this sort of made sense. In the spring, pollen was reported more, and that tended to decrease over the summer, more so in the south than in the north. And then heat was a bigger trigger in the summer, particularly in the south over here. And air quality here in the north we have problems with ozone. People started to report air quality problems over the course of the summer. And that's just self-report of what patients think their triggers are. what happens if you actually measure pollen counts, or you actually measure, correlate that to temperature at those geolocations? And we were actually able to do that. And so over April, May, June, and July of 2015, you can see here, these are what patients reported as their triggers in the south in red and their triggers in the north in the solid blue line here. These were actual pollen counts in the south and actual pollen counts in the north, and you can sort of see here that our northerners sort of reporting pollen as a trigger sort of tracks right behind the peak of the pollen season over here, and the weather data correlates as would be expected. And this is just showing this data and temperature in a different way, and I'm not going to sort of dwell on that, but you can sort of see here that as you got into summer, more people were reporting heat as a trigger of their asthma. But one of those sort of interesting things, and I have to credit Dr. Powell with this because this was his idea, was during the time we were conducting this study, there were actually a series of very intense wildfires in Washington state. And because that was on the West Coast and a lot of our participants are on the West Coast, we wanted to see if we can see the impact of the pollution from any of those wildfires on participants in our study. And so we actually took public data of air quality index from the CDC and tried to map that out with patients who were reporting their air quality as a trigger of their asthma symptoms. And you can see here that we were actually able to capture about 5 or 6 of these wildfires, Sleepy Hollow, Wolverine, and these wildfires over here. And just to give you some context, with the air quality index, the ones that are dangerous to all comers is probably AQIs over 150. AQIs between 50 and 100 are probably relevant for a sensitive population, maybe for somebody like asthma, and definitely 150 were going to be sort of significant for people. And you can see here that people's reporting of symptoms actually correlated with the AQIs that were being published from those areas. And so we were able to capture actually people having symptoms from asthma to external events in real time. We then set about sort of trying to see if we can collect this data into our electronic medical record. And this was a very large endeavor, and we really were only able to pilot this, but we were able to create a field in Epic where you can track a patient's peak flow if they were participating in the study. Now, mind you, most of these patients weren't Sinai patients, so we were not able to capture data on most of these patients. But we did have a handful of patients from my practice who were techies and participating in the study and sort of did this eagerly, and I'm sort of very grateful for them, and I'll show you some of that data. And so we developed these fields where you can decide you can indicate what the patient's personal best peak flow was, what would happen when their peak flow dropped to 60% of their personal best, which is a sort of common threshold for somebody who's getting into trouble. And you can also specify how much data you want to receive. I mean, I couldn't be getting peak flow readings of patients every single day of innumerable amounts of patients. But you can get, say, a monthly report of someone's trends. And you can also indicate the order to let you know if someone's hitting a threshold where they're getting into trouble. And so the way this works is actually the patient had to be participating in the study, had to agree to share their data, their peak flow data, had to have my chart on their phone, and had to have my chart communicating with the health app, and the health app communicating with their study app. And so it was a little bit technically tricky, but we were able to make it happen. But if you sort of aligned all of those things, then the data from their study would feed into Epic. And just to sort of show you one patient's data here, so this was sort of one of my new young patients who had severe asthma. When she sort of started off downloading the app, she was having a peak flow of about 250, which was probably 60% of what would have been expected for her. We sort of tweaked her medications a little bit, but she was still pretty labile. You can see her peak flow variability here. Her peak flows start to get better here on her new therapy, and then she sort of takes a dive here to 60% of her personal best. And at this point, I got an email into my inbox, and I was able to call her. And we were able to treat her exacerbation at home. And that's just an example of one patient, and we were not able to do this on a large scale, but it gives you a sort of idea of the potential of this kind of technology. And so sort of what were we able to accomplish? I think that this technology showed, I think, a lot of potential in terms of research and some limitations. We were able to develop and pilot remote consent, and like I said, I have the gray hair to prove it. That was not to develop all of this and to get it approved by the IRB. We did it in 7 months, and so it was done on a pretty aggressive time scale that was dictated by Apple. We were able to demonstrate that it's possible to do completely remote participation of low-risk research. We were able to collect data on 6,000 people in 6 months, which is pretty good, from all over the United States. We were able to collect longitudinal data, geolocated data, data on air quality, and data on participants. The data made sense. It seemed to correlate with people who had asthma, and that suggested that the data was of reasonable quality obtained by this method. We were able to identify the impact of environmental events on their asthma, and we were able to set the stage for integration of this data with the EMR. In terms of the flaws, you can see what they are. There's attrition over time, and so this is probably better for a shorter-term study, a cross-sectional study, or if you want longitudinal involvement, you're going to have to incentivize them in some way. And that can be micropayments, it can be gamification. There's a number of methods that are being studied to sort of do this. And you have to be aware of selection bias. Now, our platform was only available on Apple, and that restricted who was able to participate in this. And so if you're going to do this and you want population-based data, you have to do this across a variety of platforms to make sure that many people can participate. And so let me just finish by talking about a little bit where this types of technology might be going with asthma care and both with research. And so there's a large variety of smart inhalers that are being developed. And I see Juan and Alex in the audience here, and I know those guys are already working with some of these devices. But one of the biggest problems in asthma is adherence. You know, patients are taking about 50% of their medication, and probably more than half your patients are taking it wrong. And so these devices are being developed to try to impact some of these issues. There are medication reminders to improve adherence. There are devices, this one in particular, that's not FDA approved yet, but is being developed to sort of take your breath flow and actually be able to give you feedback about whether your technique is correct or not. And I'm very excited about that, if that has the potential to do that. And right now, I will tell you from personal experience that almost every major inhaled medication company is in partnership with the developer of these devices, and the development of these is proceeding at a very, very rapid pace. And the finance markets are very excited about this. They predict that this market is going to be worth about $3.5 billion in 2004. And is that good or is that bad? I'm not really sure. So first of all, does any of it work? You know, there are some data that shows some increase in asthma control, but the data, and I'm going to speed up for time constraints now, but the data is actually fairly limited right now. In this Cochrane review, telemonitoring in and of itself was not really been found to improve asthma control. And so I think you have to offer more than monitoring. What happens after you collect the data becomes very important. And I think this is going to be important because of what these devices potentially could do for cost if this is done wrong. And so we all know, anybody who practices clinical medicine now knows how hard it is to get inhaled medications for paper. Take Medicaid, for example, a high group of ER users and hospital users. Asthma medication in 2012 and 2013, and I'll argue that this has probably gone up by another 25% since then, cost New York State Medicaid $500 million in this year. That cost increased 25% from 2008 and 2012, and actually medications is now the greatest expense in asthma care. It has far surpassed hospitalization and ER use. And so if we're going to introduce technology into these devices, we're going to need to do it in a way that facilitates patient care and doesn't just drive up cost of these devices. And so just to sort of close, I think I kind of came into this project really as a skeptic. I was like, how is an app going to improve patient care? And I think I really under-recognized the potential of these tools as research tools. I think these devices are going to completely change how we do clinical trials. When I started doing clinical trials in asthma, and this is still done in academic clinical trials, we use paper diaries. And people, we know what people do with paper diaries. People forget to fill them out, and then they show up at their research visits, and they're backfilling the data, okay? You can't do that with these devices. These devices time and date stamp data, and that improves the quality and accuracy of the data that you're getting. And so a lot of drug clinical trials use electronic diaries. They're really horrible. They're like old Palm Pilots. If any of you guys, I'm going to date myself. Do you remember what Palm Pilots looked like all those years ago? I think that what's going to happen is that's going to all be app-based in the future. When you participate in a study, you're going to have an app on your phone. You're going to input your data, and your data can go directly into the study database. You're not going to have someone hand inputting data into a database. So I think these are going to completely change how clinical trials are done. I think this is going to completely change how epidemiology is done. I showed you CDC data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. That's done by random digit dialing and by paper surveys. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a landline anymore. I don't know how you do those surveys with those technologies. Those surveys are going to have to be done using these technologies. So this is going to change how we do asthma epidemiology. And then the question is, are these devices that are linked to our phones going to enhance or hurt care? Do these technology work? Are they going to improve adherence? Are they going to improve inhaler technique? Are they going to reduce cost, or are they just going to increase the cost of these devices? And those are sort of open questions that remain to be seen. I hope we figure out a way to do this that actually enhances patient care. So I'm going to sort of stop there and thank a very large group of people who made this project possible. Most of them were from our lead PI out of the ICON Institute, and our lead PI was Yvonne Chan, who leads the digital health group over there, and Pei Wang, who was the master of all these analysis, and a large group of people who participated in the analysis of these data, which is a massive data set. Our technologists from a group called LifeMap Solutions, including Steve Hirschman, Rod Edgar, and Eric Kroc. And support of our individual departments who donated our work to sort of make this work possible. And I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
You can take one question or something.
Hey, Linda. It was great. Congratulations on getting the consent actually on the app. We've been involved in a project for over 2 years that's funded through CMS, and it's run by Village Care, which is a community-based organization. And they enrolled over 5,000 people with HIV into this program. And Sinai, being Sinai, requested that we had to have a separate consent.
Yeah.
So we did.
When was that?
So the project actually started in 2014. We actually were late to the game because of this separate consent, but it allowed us to really look at the program. Actually, what this was for is there's online chatting, there's a health coach, and it's really about adherence. And the good news is we're actually able to show that we had a 47% undetectable rate in people who weren't undetectable before HIV meds. That was the good news. But the bad news was when we went through and did our consent, we found out that 10% of the population that was from Sinai actually didn't have HIV. And yet they signed consent saying that they had HIV. And the reason why, I think it comes down to that incentive. So you said you didn't give an incentive, whereas on this app, you actually got $35 for it.
So you had people, yeah. So the incentive can be perverse.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's the one thing we have to be really cautious, because I was shocked that people would be willing to say they had HIV to participate
In a study. Wow, that's actually a really good lesson, and I'll sort of have to remember that. And I think, yeah, when you do things remotely, you're going to have to be careful about what the incentives are to participate. As we know, there probably are people sitting out there who don't have anything better to do with their time and might participate data, and so you're going to have to validate your data somehow. And how did you guys verify that how did you find out that they didn't have HIV?
Because we had anybody with Sinai had to sign a Sinai consent.
To check their actual medical
And so
records.
we actually looked at the outcomes, and so we went to the medical record and we compared their and when we went in,
You're like, couldn't find a positive HIV test.
It turned out they were friends or family.
And they said, hey, you want to do something that gets you $35? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, good. That's a good take-home lesson. Anybody have any other questions? Great.
Let's thank Dr.
Thank you.